Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this installment of the Pamela Turbeville Speaker Series as part of the Francis McClelland Institute for Children, Youth, and Families, or FMI as we call ourselves. My name is Melissa Barnett. I'm the director of FMI. And before I introduce today's speaker, I want to share a couple of things with you. First of all, if we can forward, thanks. First of all, we want to acknowledge where we are at the University of Arizona and the debts we owe to the people whose lands we reside on by sharing the official land acknowledgement of the University of Arizona, which was developed in partnership with tribal representatives. We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. We also want to tell you a little bit about FMI if you're unfamiliar with us. Our goal is to use the power of research to work collaboratively to build family and community resilience so that children, youth, and families, especially those experiencing adversity, have opportunities to thrive. We do this by supporting innovative research, actively partnering with community organizations, sharing research findings with practitioners and the community, and educating the next generation of engaged scholars and leaders. All of the work that we do is to honor the legacy of Francis McClelland. She was generous, she was passionate, she had a vision, and she really was an advocate for resiliency, and she understood how we could use research to improve lives. We also want to thank and recognize another notable U of A alum and supporter, Pamela Turbeville, who's a graduate of the Norton School of Human Ecology, but under a different name, and who continues to be a staunch supporter of us. So thank you to Pam. Finally, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the spring, and I would say a friend of the Human Development and Family Science program, a regular supporter of our graduate students by serving on our committees. Dr. Michelle Téllez is an associate professor and director of graduate studies in the Department of Mexican American Studies at the University of Arizona. She earned her PhD in education from Claremont Graduate University. Her public and academic scholarship focuses on transnational community formations, mothering, and gendered migration along the US-Mexico borderlands. Among other notable scholarly achievements, she is the author of Border Women and the Community of Maclovio Rojas, Autonomy in the Spaces of Neoliberal Neglect, which was a winner of the 2023 National Association of Chicana Studies Book of the Year Award. Connected to her academic work, she has a long history in grassroots organizing projects, digital media, and community-based arts and performance. Very happy to have you join us today.
Thank you.
I will let Patel go from there because. Thank you for coming.
Ready. Thank you for being here this Friday afternoon. It's a beautiful day, and I hope we have a great discussion. I'm honored to be here, to see so many familiar, friendly faces, and just to honor the work that you all have been doing as part of this series and in your college and school. So thank you for the invitation. All right, so trying to get used to all the new technology. Here, what you see up there, what I see down here. Okay. All right. So thank you for talking a bit about my work. So just a bit about me, very briefly, as a segue into this conversation and to what I'll be talking about today. So I have two images here on the PowerPoint, right? And one, of course, on the top is a constellation image, and on the bottom is an actual image of the U.S.-Mexico border. And so I grew up in San Diego, and really navigating that border experience between San Diego and Tijuana, right? Something that I experience in my day-to-day interactions, right? I always joke with my students that I grew up eating Fruity Loopies, not Fruit Loops, because we used to go to Comercial Mexicana on Sundays to go grocery shopping, right? And of course, this is before NAFTA, this is the 80s, things were a lot cheaper. It was better to go shopping in Mexico. That has totally changed. And now I've been in the Sonoran corridor for 20 years, right? And so, I mean, both of these sort of ecologies, right? Both political ecologies, social ecologies, have shaped me as a thinker, as a researcher, as a person, as a community member, right? And of course, that bottom image shows this real stark divide between San Diego County and Playas de Tijuana, right? That border, and so in this wall that is kind of jutting out to the ocean, where engineers believe that they can like literally divide the ocean, right? And so the ironies are stark as well. And then the top image is a constellation that was created in collaboration with some of the founders of the project that I'm involved in called Binational Arts Residency. And there we've been looking at creating artistic practice in community around issues of social justice across this corridor, right? And so we try to think about this region as a constellation, right? Where, Phoenix, Tucson, Nogales, Hermosillo are connected culturally, experientially, in family, economically, et cetera, right? Of course, not to deny the actual border, right? And so it's with these kind of ideas that I'm thinking through and with in a lot of my work, actually. And so I use borderlands as a generative concept to help us think beyond demarcation, to focus on people, to focus on communities. I'm thinking about how they live, work, build families, exchange culture across the border and under the auspices of a divide that's real, right? And so a lot of my work looks at, what can border communities teach us, right? Okay. So for today's discussion, I guess the guiding question is, how might digital public archives offer a more accessible modality for teaching and learning about marginalized histories in border regions? And then I ask this, as I'm thinking through it, but also as a question for you all to help me think through this, right? After I talk about some of these projects, offer some ideas, maybe you all can tell me what you think about this premise in and of itself, right? Okay, so I'm gonna just jump into talking about these two projects that I've been working on over the last 2 years, and then offer some ideas about the potentials and the possibilities of archival work, and then move into our discussion. Okay, so here's where I'm gonna navigate to, is it Firefox?
Yes, right there.
Okay, so, and then there we go. No, that's not the right one. It's funny because it's the next slide over, it's the next website over, but you see how it's like blocked? Sorry. Oh, one more. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so the first one is called the Mapping Chicana, Mexicana Voices in the Borderlands, right? And this project is an oral history project that was funded by the Crossing Latinidades initiative via the Mellon Foundation, that was hosted at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and they made a call for projects in 2022, right? And so it was a 2-year project, and it involved the consortium of HSIs, right? And so you had to work cross-institutionally. And so our project highlights women's organizing in South Texas and Southern Arizona, and we focus on the time periods between the late 1960s and all the way through 2010. And so for us, we're thinking about key moments during and after the Chicano movement, and of course, everything that's happened since then. And so really the premise of our project is that we were discussing how women's histories and stories are really centered in Chicano political history. And so our goal is to create a digital archive to, 1, record their stories, 2, make them publicly accessible, especially to those who lack sort of institutional access, right? That might impede their access to such material. And so overall, our hope was to democratize, right, history, right, how history is accessed, and equally important, how history is produced, right? And so I say all that, but I want to begin with just acknowledging that this work is deeply collaborative, and we came to many of these ideas in conversation and in consultation, and through sort of collective thinking around what we wanted to arrive to, right? And so I want to acknowledge my co-PIs, Dr. Jennifer Nájera, who's at the University of California, Riverside, and Dr. Cristina Salinas, who's at the University of Texas at Arlington. And then we have a whole team of thinkers that are working with us. We had 6 graduate students that worked with us over the course of 2 years, 3 each year across different institutions, because they were fellows as well, and then they were assigned to our project. We worked with website development teams. Notably, we worked here with the University of Arizona Center for Digital Humanities. It was fantastic to sort of learn about what they do at the center. And then they gave us a web developer to work with that helped sort of bring to life the ideas that we had around the project. And then so you can kind of see here some of the funding support that we also got for some of the other parts of the project that involve, hosting symposiums and other conversations. Okay, so over the 2 years, 22 to 2024, our team traveled between Texas and Arizona to record oral histories with Chicana Mexicana organizers that fell into that, sort of timeline that I mentioned earlier. We engaged women by drawing from our existing, networks. Sorry, double-sided, thank you for doing that. Our existing networks, whether they be academic, personal, and activist connections in the regions, right? And then, that I'll talk about in a second, we also offered them different levels of being able to participate, like different levels of consent of how they wanted to participate in the project. And at the end of those 2 years, we conducted 34 oral histories, and then we really sort of modeled. I want to also acknowledge Chicana por mi raza, which is another digital archive that really sort of embodies this idea of centering Chicana history in these larger historiographies that don't include them. And so we also were in consultation with them over this entire period, Dr. Maria Cotera and Dr. Linda Garcia Merchant, who really helped us shape, what we were doing here. And then finally after, and I'll talk more later about what it took to get here, but we launched the websites and the archives in November of this last year, November of 2024, right? And so we chose to center these border regions with large populations of Latinx communities, primarily of Mexican origin, people in historically conservative states, because we wanted to better understand how women were mobilizing around progressive social political issues in contexts that are often hostile. And to that end, our project is significant because both regions have histories of invisibilizing the very stories and histories our project is highlighting. Book bans, curriculum rewrites, immigration raids, attacks on workers, and conservative educational reform often begins in Latinx communities, right? And so through our archive, people will be able to listen to the textures of women's voices, often fluidly switching between English and Spanish. The voices and languages themselves communicate the culture of the borderlands regions of South Texas and Southern Arizona. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint, if I may. I mean, it's not that important. It's just showing the research questions. There we go. So our research questions centered around, what strategies and tactics have women organizers in the borderlands used to fight against and transform political and economic structures? And how have the border regions of South Texas and Southern Arizona influenced women's political organizing historically and in the present, right? Now, and what I'm presenting today is not necessarily the answers to those questions, right? Because we're just at the stage of having launched the site, right? And then what's going to come now in the next year is the writing, right, of everything that we've learned from these women over the last 2 years. But I did want to share the a couple of the oral histories, just so you can kind of get a sense of the website and what it looks like. So back here, so if I go to Arizona, well, let me start in Texas, then I'll end in Arizona. So you can see that of the women that we featured, we have a photo. On the bottom, there's an interactive map. You'll see it looks very different in Arizona, right? Because the towns are connected, but they like sort of stretch across versus, the women that we had access to kind of like were real central in that constellation a bit that I showed you earlier. And then if you click on each woman, you get access to a bit of their oral history, right? It's just an audio clip and a little bit of the ephemera that tells their story. And this is where some people decided that they wanted their oral history publicly accessible and others didn't. And if they chose not to, their history is still accessible in our repository that they will then have access to. So that's where you see access materials. People will email us and then ask to use them, right? So let me go to let me go to Arizona. And just so you can see, right, so it looks very different. Let me see if I can I'm not used to this computer, but anyways, you can just kind of see how it looks in this region, right? It kind of goes up and down a bit. But I wanted to share a bit of the oral histories from two of our participants. One is Isabel Garcia, who's sort of a local hero here in this region, right? Has been politically active, comes from a family of activists, a father who was, a community leader, and is a human rights lawyer, was a public defender. And let me see a second clip. All right, so hopefully the sound works. I'll just share about a minute of it.
And stuff. I was in law school. It was Friday night. I was watching the news, and I saw that one of the war on poverty programs that were established under President Johnson. He established war on poverty programs, so he did area councils and different things here. And I saw the news, they raided the Manzo Area Council because they were helping migrants. After school on Monday, guess where I went? To the Manzo. And that's it. That's it. That's it. And then that changed that guided my life, I just really did. Started working with immigrants, we first started with the campaigns because they were alleging that me helping you fill out a form was aiding and abetting.
I'll stop it here so you can come back to the site and listen more. So that just kind of gives you an example of what one woman's entry looks like. And then some of the photos that go along with the archive. And then there are more photos in the repository. So if somebody wants to do research, about this work, then they'll have access to some of the back end stuff. And we're still finishing it, to be honest with you, because that repository work takes a lot of time, right? And then one more, and then I'll move on to the next project. So Isabel, does a lot of human rights work. I mean, you can't talk about how we understand human rights work in the borderlands without thinking of Isabel Garcia and the Mujeres de Manzo, because they've really shaped how we understand what has become known as the militarization of the border. I mean, that kind of language wasn't used prior to some of these activists really developing the language, counting the deaths in the border region, right? Counting the migrants who have been lost, et cetera, right? Okay, so, and then Kim Dominguez is another era. She comes from the HB 2281 movement, right, which is the anti-ethnic studies bill here in Arizona. She comes of age during that whole political movement, having been a student of the Mexican American Studies program in high school, and then moving into college and sort of continuing that work because she saw the dismantling of, this precious knowledge that she had received. So, however, being in the movement, she realized that there were still tensions around, misogyny, patriarchy, power, right, embedded in how they interacted with each other as activists, right? And so this one clip that I'll share with you, I think, I won't, I'll share that one, why not?
Yeah, and Jose, who was my American government teacher, he loses it, and he's like, you hate men, you hate men. He's screaming at me that I hate men, and I'm like crying. I'm like, no, like, I love you. This is why I'm giving you feedback. Like, and Lane's like, yeah, we do fucking hate men. And I'm over there all sentido. No, I love you. I'll die for you.
Yeah, I'm not sure why that sound, because it's all the way up. Sorry, technical difficulty. It's good to see that though, because at home I didn't notice that, but let me see if this one sounds really low.
So when it was like on desks and hadn't actually passed, I believe we had a lot of vigils, we had a lot of actions. Tom Horn had planned to come here, and we had walkouts. He was supposed to visit 1010, which was 1010 East 10th Street, the headquarters for Tucson Unified School District. So that's where like school board meetings and things like that would take place. And he was set to visit 1010.
So that's the kind of stuff that comes up, right? Like, oh, wait, we need to go back and fix the sound on this. But so, so it's really interesting because she offers us, a different generation, a different political moment, and how they were organizing and sort of the issues that came up for them within their circles. She went on to develop a zine called Malintzin, right, which really spoke back to some of those power struggles that were happening in the movement, and then sort of maintain that that commitment in her work. She's now the director here on campus of the Women and Gender Cultural Center. Okay, all right. So that's the mapping project, right? So I'm going to jump into the next project, which, so I was doing these simultaneously over the 2 years. I was lucky, I applied for 2 projects thinking I'd hope I get one, and then I ended up getting 2, so it was a very busy 2 years. Okay, so the Afro-Chicanx Digital Humanities Project, memories, let me go to the homepage. Memories, narratives, and oppositional consciousness of Black diasporas is also funded again by the Mellon. It's cross-institutional, cross-regional. But here what we do is explore the identities, experiences, and histories of people of African descent within Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx communities and Mexican communities in the diaspora. Through oral histories, we examine how people who self-identify as Afro-Mexican, Blaxican, Afro-Chicana, Afro-Chicanx, Black, and Mexican understand, navigate, and shape Blackness across the US-Mexico borderlands. And how we focus on 3 sites, which is interesting. I'll talk about this, is Albuquerque in New Mexico, Tucson here in Arizona, and then Santa Barbara, California, right? So these are not big cities. I mean, when you think of like really diverse, big cities, you might think Houston, maybe even Phoenix, Los Angeles, Chicago, right? And here we're focusing on smaller towns that also are a part of this idea of the borderlands, right? Because migration shapes their families, their histories, how these towns came to be, these cities came to be. And so I guess here we're really thinking about like the borderlands as broadly defined, right? And so a little bit of the context around this project is that, in our field of Latinx, Chicanx scholarship, right? This identity or this experience has really focused on the colonial period and the interrogation of contemporary experiences of people who identify as Afro-Latinx or Afro-Chicanx has not been explored, right? And so we're trying to fill that gap in one area. And importantly, we are especially attentive to the legacies of anti-Blackness in Latinx and Chicanx communities. And the mandate of this work is to facilitate these critical interdisciplinary conversations. So we ask these questions of scholars and disciplines that have historically erased Blackness within our fields, right? Not only in our communities, but within our fields, right? So if you look at part of one of the papers we're looking at, I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent, but one of the papers that we're looking at is if we look at the curriculum in Latino studies programs, Chicano studies programs across the US, 0 classes on Blackness, or that's not true, maybe not 0, there's 2, right? And so our intention here is to think beyond representation while contributing to a growing field that looks at the African diaspora in all its manifestations, right? Okay, and then research questions here. is how do Afro-Mexican and Afro-Chicanx communities disrupt, navigate, and negotiate their identities? How do they identify? How do they maintain or practice these identities? What is their knowledge of Blackness or African diaspora in Latin America? So these are sort of the framing questions in our interviews with the participants. And I want to say that, in fact, I didn't do this, so let me go back. I really want to say again that this project was deeply collaborative as well, and my co-PIs, tremendous scholars. Dr. Dora Cariaga Coleman is at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Micaela Villa-Sanchez is at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And we also had a team of 6 students, right, that worked with us over the course of the 2 years. We then worked with the UNM web development team out of their IT department. We had associate researchers. We actually also worked with a photographer, a tremendous photographer rooted in Veracruz, who helped us. I'll show you what we did with her with some of the workshops. We had a film team with this project who helped us do. So here we actually did videos of the oral histories, and so you'll see those shortly. And portraits of each of the women. Of each of the participants. So it was a massive team. And then we worked with Dr. Linda Garcia Mergent, who's at the University of Houston. She was a consultant, and then eventually participated in the project, right? And so that, we kind of pulled her in. And so just acknowledging that this work isn't done just by one person, right? It's done in collaboration because we all have areas of expertise, and we need to build and learn, sort of skill share with one another in the work. Okay, so part of our project, our project was also informed by the recent historical moments in Mexico, right, where after decades of activism, a coalition of activists were able to get the Mexican government to finally recognize communities of African descent in Mexico, which shifted, how they were counted in the census of 2020. And we discovered, what communities always knew, but there you saw that 32 states, right, had Afro-descended communities in their states, right? And that's something that is unacknowledged in the notion of like the nation state, right, of Mexico. So in this context, right, that many Mexicans who were not part of the formally recognized previously began to acknowledge themselves and acknowledge the Black presence in Mexico. And so I think we started thinking about, and really Dora Cariaga was the lead in this, right, how that affects communities on this side, right? And so there's multiple communities. It's like those who are Afro-Mexican descendants, but then there's also like Afro-Chicanos, Blaxican, those who have come from mixed families here in the US, right? And how has that like manifested itself in the borderlands? Okay, so, and so we really centered the notion of Afro-Chicanx, right? Again, sort of repeating what I said earlier, is because we as Chicanx and Latinx scholars have a responsibility to critically examine the political, social, and cultural foundations of Afro-Mexican subjectivities, to imagine how, when, where, and why these identities shift, change, and transform their lives, right? And how that impacts our curriculums. And so here we really wanted to build sort of an archive that began offering those discussions, right? And so we did various things. So let me talk a little bit about that. How am I doing my time? So you look back.
No, you're good.
Okay. So for this project, what we did was, in each of the sites, we did what we called consciousness raising circles, right? That included photo workshops. Coral did some photography workshops, and where she invited folks to bring in photos of their family members to kind of think through like where their families' histories, what they could recover even in just the photos by talking through photos, that they help tell a story about migration, about descendants, about what is excluded, what is included, etc. We did workshops around cuisine, around understanding the Afro roots of some of the cuisine in Mexico, particularly on the east coast of Mexico. And through these workshops, we hope that then those participating who might identify in some of these categories would want to have their oral histories, taken. And it wasn't easy. There was a lot of work in terms of like organizing all the workshops, but also having people initially want to share their story because there has been such attack on their own identities, right? Okay, so let me share first what we did, like sort of a 1-minute video of all the workshops. You can kind of get a sense of what we did in these 3 sites over the course of 2 years. And Maria Alarcón made the
derrocha.
Y cuando este son resuena, su cuerpo alegría derrocha.
Adiós, adiós, mi morena, adiós.
Ay, morena, adiós.
Otra vuelta, mi morena.
Y vuelvo a decir adiós.
Al sonar de mi guitarra y cantando con pasión, frota sus manos y agarra. Suavecito el corazón que por dentro se desgarra.
So that gives you a little sense of what we were doing in each place. And then let me walk you through the site a bit. So this is...
Every day, our world gets a little...
So this is the link to the oral history. I'll come back to that. Let me just show you first, for example, what we did with the portraits. We included a quote from each participant as a way to sort of like center, their story and with their photo. I showed you, well, actually there's also a whole page of, photos of the workshops that you just saw. It was interesting in Santa Barbara, there's this park called Ortega Park on the east side of Santa Barbara. And it's a historically, Mexican community, indigenous community. And this park in the cement, somebody long ago had sort of traced Chicano power into it. And so then one of the young people, on top wrote Afro, right? And so that's where that photo comes from. I'll let you all peruse. One interesting thing that we did was the family album. So some of the participants shared family photos. And again, because we see photography, right, as a resource to reconstruct identity, family, community genealogy. And so if you go to those who were willing to share, right, you click on their name. There's one photo and we recorded them talking about that one photo. And then, we include some of the photos that they shared as a way for them to recognize their own histories of being from Afro-descendant communities and having it been unacknowledged, right, in their own family stories. So they're trying to recover those stories. One important element of our project is this reading list that we developed. And we wanted to offer a way in which people could enter the conversation by establishing a set of readings, right? And so if you go in, the first section is on grounding theories and Chicanx, Latinx, diaspora studies, feminist studies, decolonial theory. There's a large section on Afro-Mexico, right? And it really, again, that is sort of linked to this idea that I mentioned earlier, that the colonial period is really centered in a lot of the scholarship. Borderlands, we're hoping that our work will start adding to that collection. But yeah, so, again, an invitation to kind of peruse some of the readings, to take up some of the literature that we've put together here, right? And this came from constant conversations, retreats, thinking across our fields, seeking consultation outside of our circle, right? And then this is how we put this together, and it's ongoing, right? We're inviting folks to like add to it. Okay, so let me finally just go back to this, the oral histories. Let me share two. I'll start with jazz. Let's see. I forgot to open this link, but I think it'll be fine. Fast forward it just a little bit. When she starts talking, we said, how do you identify? How do you maintain these practices? And so lots of stuff comes up in the conversations. Just fast forward to like mid. And of course, a lot of these are over an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours long.
So for forever, it took me a long time to feel comfortable as knowing that when I identify myself, I know what that means, right? And that I can express that. Does that make sense? And so today I identify proudly as Afro-Chicana. And I think growing up and dealing with discrimination, racism, and not just from outside, not from just white people, but also trying to identify within these two cultures that you come from, these two identities that on the surface maybe not so much the same, but when you are navigating what that is, living in these two different worlds, is it African American? Is it directly from Africa? Like you have those conversations, like where exactly do we come from? So for a long time it wasn't saying Black, right? It's like, especially growing up, it was like Black was like a bad word, And so do you identify as Black? Do you identify as African American? Because that's what more politically sound, but that doesn't cover all of Black people. All Black people don't just come from Africa, So I think, and talking to my mom, who until we started having these deeper conversations around race, is like it was always Spanish, right? It was never Mexican. It was never, and then it was this Hispanic word where it's like, well, where is Hispania? Like where exactly does that come from? And then you learn about sort of, through poetry, I learned a lot about culture, identifying, seeing people who look like me and how they identify, and was wondering, does that fit me? And then learning about sort of the Chicana movement, the Black Power movement. I think those are things that empower you to be able to begin to create that sense of self, and knowing, like, it doesn't necessarily matter. I'll call myself Blaxican. I'm a mixed girl. I'm a mixed girl. I am all those elements, And so today, as a activist, as somebody who I feel finds power in the words and has done some sort of soul searching, it's Afro-Chicana, right? It covers, I think, that myriad of what is Blackness, right? Because it's not just Black, it's not just this color, right? And what is Chicana? It encompasses these complicated identities, right? And gives honor to both. And so it's always about honor.
Okay, so that's jazz. And then I'll share one from here from Tucson, Joseph. And I think it'll just be the first couple minutes.
Yeah, I always called myself a Blaxican. I always made sure to represent both. But then I found out about the East Indian, I found out about the Native American, so Now I just say, oh, I'm a whole lot of stuff. But growing up, I thought it was just Black and Mexican for the most part. And I really, personally, I identified more with Blacks. Not for any reason against the Hispanic culture or my Mexican culture. It's just that growing up, I received a lot more racism for being Black than being Mexican here in Tucson. From Mexicans and Chicanos. And so, you know, growing up as a minority, everything is always a fight. So we don't shy away from those fights. We go at them. So getting that backlash or that kickback about being Black, it made me want to represent them even more. I felt like I needed to be stronger for that, to have more pride in that and show, no, I am Black and I don't care if you don't like it or not. I always had this saying that I would tell myself, it's Black power with a little brown pride on the side.
Okay, I'll stop there. So this is the archive, the Afro-Chicanx archive, and I invite you to further explore it. So let me make a few comments around methodology. As I've mentioned several times, right, that this work is deeply collaborative. You know, not one person, you know, has ownership over it, and both projects are embedded across multiple sites, right? So that requires a lot of logistics. For the first project, the Chicana Mexicanas in the borderlands, you know, developing the project began before the obviously before the grant, you know, writing the proposal. We decided we really wanted to focus on pláticas, oral histories, right? That has a long tradition in our fields. And then the learning curve was the digital archive part, right? I mean, I've done digital media work over the course of my own career, but there's a lot of, you know, points to doing this work that is sort of behind the scenes that I, you know, wanted to just highlight, right? So to build a digital archive, you know, you have to lead like the metadata coding that goes in the repository. You have to work with the web development team to kind of figure out, you know, we want this, what does it look like? What do we have to provide to them so that they can make that happen on the public facing site? You know, you know, all of it required a lot of collaboration. You know, we had this notion of trying to map the stories so that visually we could sort of see where these stories were located, you know, and so for the Chicana Mexicana one, you know, I showed you like the differences in the two sites, and then if people were interested, they could click on one, because you can click on the map and kind of see what is near here, and maybe then look into further research about what was happening in those you know, in that location, in particular historical moments, right? For the Afro-Chicanx project, similarly, right, we had to develop the project in advance of the grant, conduct the interviews across the three sites, also design it together with the film and web development team, you know, build the content. Oh, I forgot the transcriptions, right? Really like working on that. That's the stuff that y'all do in regular research, but here, because we're going to be making the repository accessible, right, they have to be really clean for public consumption, right, so that the interviews are legible. We want people to be able to use this material. Both sites were published in 2024. We were inspired, I mentioned earlier, Chicana por mi raza, so we were inspired by other projects, right? There's many. I mean, there's a department here, you know, in the libraries that, you know, we met with to help us think through some of the ideas that we were trying to pull together. And like I mentioned, now is the time where we're starting to think about, like, well, what do we do with the material? How do we write about it, right? And, you know, I'm not a scholar of the archive, right? I'm not an archivist either. But I landed here because we saw that there was an absence, right, that we wanted to resolve in the historiographies, in the visibility, right? And so, I'm starting to delve into this material and this literature around archival work, and we have a fantastic scholar on campus, Jamie A. Lee, who wrote a book called Producing the Archival Body that came out in 2021. So if you're interested in this, I highly recommend. But she says this, right? She says, I consider the archives as both location and a practice. As a location, the archives is a place, physical, digital, and virtual, where archival collections are organized, contained, preserved, and made accessible. As a practice, the archives and the acts of archiving are the techniques used to collect, organize, and make accessible the products and performances of histories, knowledges, relations, and memories. And so, here what Jamie Lee and some of the work that she's or some of the scholars that she's in conversation with are doing is really helping us think about how to, to unpack the archive, right? Because an archive, like as we know them in an institution like a university, right, is seen as like, truth, official, but it also begs the question of like, what becomes an archive? Who makes a decision of what's important to archive, right? And so really an archive is laden with notions of objectivity, neutrality, but there's always somebody making a decision around what constitutes an archive, right? And so I think about archives that are institutionally tied as being laden with power, in concert at least with power, right? And so I think in this work and in learning from the people who are really embedded in this work on archival scholarship, I think about our archives as a possibility, right? For reconciliation, for justice, for redress, for naming what has not been named, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And, we've designed, right, going back to that question, that guiding question I opened up with, right? So we've designed the websites and archives to be used, right, for education and not just in the institution, right? For community work, for people who are interested in learning about their family's history, perhaps, right? And so we think that, if something sparks their interest on this site, then they might go back and do further research that is connected to that historical moment, right? Both projects center the borderlands, as I mentioned. Both are about democratizing knowledge, what counts as knowledge, whose histories are valued, recorded, right? And of course about democratizing access, right? And so really we can think about borders that are not just about crossing, right? But there's also what creates a border and, what happens in the place and what happens to the people in those places, right? That we want to be able to document. So I think in both projects, I want to acknowledge that participants eventually were really thrilled to be able to tell their story because nobody had really asked them to tell their story. I think about some of the women in Téllez who are elders who had done amazing work, who had their own archives in their garages that might get lost, right? And they're like, oh, you value the work that I did 15 years ago when I ran for superintendent, or when I created the Raza Unida party, or when I organized farm workers, or when I, and the same within the Afro-Chicanx project. I mean, they, having the language to describe their experience really changes, how they move in the world and how they see themselves, which I think was really important. So I think to close, a couple of the things that I've been thinking about in this work. One is sustainability, right? I mean, that's a massive issue that I'm barely scratching at the surface trying to think about, in terms of climate catastrophe and cooling systems and data centers. I mean, that I really do think about that stuff. And the digital work, right, relies on all of that. So on the one hand, it's accessible and yet it's damaging. Books, we can hold on to them for hundreds of years potentially, barring natural disasters, right? So that's one. I also do, so on the very, on the one hand, I'm thinking this is democratizing access, and then I'm thinking, well, who is the audience, right? Who actually is, accessing the archive? And so to try to resolve that, we're actually working on a grant for the mapping project with the Museum of South Texas History, where we're trying to get a grant to create oral history learning oral history listening centers. And so that then the archive can be accessible. We'll do some community events, maybe we'll do a history harvest. And that's one way to kind of make sure that people know about them, because like how else will they find it, right? And so we're thinking about that. Another thing I've been thinking about that a colleague of mine, when we were doing a presentation in Santa Barbara, helped me understand was that these websites probably need toolkits. So we need to apply for some funding to help somebody create a toolkit for the site so they know how to, so I walked you through it, and I'm sure most people can walk through it and kind of figure things out, but it might have been helpful that I, told you how things came to be and why and what we hope to, have impact with in doing what we've done, right? So a toolkit, and I guess I'll conclude by saying, we created these projects collectively as scholars in disciplines that have historically erased Blackness and women. And it's not surprising that both teams are women-led, guided by feminist methodologies, right? So I want to acknowledge that, like the six of us, identify as that, right? Really thinking through a decolonial practice in our work. And so when we think about Chicano grand narratives and historiographies, we know that this is what's true. So we hope that this work disrupts that and it plants some seeds from which our communities and scholars can build from. Thank you so much for listening.
Plenty of time for questions.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So, I have a question. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. Super interesting stuff, really compelling. Thinking about like the first project and the various folk who you spoke to, how did you go about engaging the community and even identifying who to speak to?
Yeah.
And even kind of building that trust within that community to get access to these various participants, who it appears to be a lot of like women activists or members of that community, and so
Yeah.
if you can speak to that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you. For that project, Cristina Salinas is from South Texas. She's from the Valley. She was, born and raised there. And so we relied a bit on her networks at first to sort of land us there. I also reached out to, we all have, in academia, right, in our field, it's small. And so, you have colleagues in different parts. You're like, hey, I'm working on a new project. Who do you think I should talk to? And so some colleagues gave me some names, and that's how we came across some of the organizations like Arise, right? Ramona Casas was somebody, I met her through a colleague. But Christina's from the Valley, and so some of those initial visits were like really like learning about where we were, right? And coming to community spaces, meeting with folks, telling them about the project, and then asking them if they would be interested in participating in the project, And so there in the Valley, I feel like it was a little slower, right? Because Christina no longer lives down there. She's up in the Dallas area, and so, and like we saw on the map, some of the communities are dispersed, and so they're not in direct conversation. In fact, we had a symposium at UT Arlington in March of 2024 where we did like a sneak peek of the website, and we invited Arizona women and women from the Valley to Arlington to do a panel and to sort of do a symposium about what was happening. And we were so surprised to find that a lot of the women from the Valley didn't know each other, versus in Arizona, most of the people knew each other, right? And so that made it a little more easier. So here, for example, I've been here for 20 years. I've been embedded in a lot of these movements, community spaces. So initially I was like, boom, 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 like we should talk to these key people. But then the same people are always telling their stories. So how do you go beyond that, right? And that's when you meet with different community members. That's what I did. I had lunch with Raul Aguirre one time. I had coffee with a student. I reached out to a woman who does advocacy work on domestic violence, right? So like, listen, this is what we're doing. You're like, you have to talk to this person. And that helped. So I guess that's snowball method, but it was deeply like community connected too, right? And I think people trusted us because Christina was from the Valley, her family's been there, and then I've been around here for a little while. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's very fascinating work. I was wondering, I don't know if this makes sense with the toolkits, or maybe this is already on your radar, but I was wondering about for both projects the idea of building out like lesson plans, and so that like educators could go and they could click in and see like certain, you could tell them which clips and which videos and which minutes to listen to like get a nuanced picture about a topic or a movement or a period of time.
I love that. Yeah, that's exactly what we need to do, right? And so we need to apply for more money, I guess. Do more work. Yeah, but thank you for that. That's fantastic, yeah.
So I've got a list.
I love it. Hey, I saw some of these videos. I saw Norma was always the first one to ask a question.
You prepared.
I'm like, it's going to be, and then when I didn't see, I was like, oh man, who's going to be the first one?
Right. Those people are great when you're like, I can always count someone to say something. So I noticed like in the Mexicana Chicana study versus the Afro-Chicanx, you had snippets in one of like the audio versus the other one, it seemed like you had the full video. And so talk about that, and so you talked a little bit about this. There's decisions to be made about what you showcase and what's like accessible, like in the front-facing page versus like what's in the archives. But like, what do you think the difference is in, in those decisions, and the value of that, of showing like the full thing versus like these snippets, which could be kind of going to this point of like, you have these snippets that speak to a topic.
Yeah. Right.
But then at the same time, you're like shortening somebody's narrative,
Right.
they can keep going further. So how did you all decide what to do in either
Sure.
project and kind of?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think that, so the Mexicana Chicana Borderlands one, is more historical, right? And so we're like highlighting these like moments, right? And they're just shorter for that reason, right? In fact, the Afro-Chicanx isn't the full video, because the full videos are over an hour to 2 hours long, right? So there's still shorter clips, but because the topic is a little bit more, like how do you arrive, like if we'd only shown, I would define myself as Afro-Chicana, like how do we arrive there, right? And so trying to sort of show a bit of that like thought process for the participant to explain without having us to explain, right? But I'm very real, we were also under a deadline, and like there were 6 of us doing this work, and so somebody sometimes had longer clips and we didn't have time to like make them all equal. And so, I mean, that's like the reality, right? I mean, we had a deadline, a report due, and you all can relate to that, right? And so, maybe at some point we can go back and further clip them, or we also have the Afro-Chicanx has an Instagram, and we do have even shorter clips on there so that folks can actually just see like, a little part of an interview, But yeah, so I think they're different topics, and so they have to help tell a particular story, and then also there was a lot of us, working, and so how do we finalize the clips? Everybody, it's all subjective. I mean, that's kind of what I was saying. Even this one is, right? So.
Do students have any questions?
Baltasar. Just kidding. Just kidding.
How'd you get to be so awesome?
So I do want to say, I have a lot of students here who are very much interested in like ethnic identity, ethnic racial identity, and so on, Afro-Chicanx identity in particular, etc. And so I'm sure that many of them would be very interested, especially in the Afro-Chicanx project, when they're talking about identity, because I think a lot of that aligns very much with narrative work that we do around understanding how one develops an identity, kind of comes to term with it, etc. So question, how does one get access to this data?
Yeah.
And my second question is, how do you imagine people using it, or what do you like? What would be like your wish for how people use it?
That's a great question. So, well, the access for the public stuff is there, I mean, you just go to the website and And what I showed you is all accessible, right? And if you want more, all you have to do is click the, access material. It sends us an email and you tell us what you want and what it's for, just so we have an idea, right, of who the person is, and then we'll give it to you, basically. So it's pretty simple as of now, right? That's how we're working. It's not like we've had a flood of emails come in, right? Because people are still learning about the material. And so right now, I think my dream is to really make it more accessible, like more visible, with the toolkit, with the lessons, with like bringing it to public spaces and, this, right? Introducing you all to it so that you hopefully will take it to the folks that you know, or people who you think might be interested in the material, and so that it's of use, right? I got kind of choked up a little bit earlier when I was telling you about the women and how they responded to our request for interviewing them, because for me, that is really significant to be able to witness someone's story and them feeling like it was worth something, it had value. And so often our communities are seeing like their life stories don't have value, and that's devastating. And so like having been able to at least begin this process, I think is fantastic for me. I feel really proud of the work that we've done collaboratively. There's some chat stuff going on here. Do I need to click on it, you think?
I've been monitoring.
Okay, good.
Yeah. And let them know if they have questions.
Okay, great. Yes.
So you mentioned that you and the team kind of gave participants autonomy, I guess, on how
Yes.
much they wanted to participate.
Yes.
And I was just kind of curious if you saw, like, as the project progressed, if potentially people were a little more standoffish, but then got more involved,
Yeah.
or how you incorporated.
That's a great question. In fact, somebody who had said they didn't want anything public facing, that once the website went live,
Yeah.
they were like, actually, like, show my stuff, And so we're like, and then I'm like, okay, it's gonna take a little while. So yeah, I think once people could see what it was, then they were really interested. Because I was also reading and learning from a scholar and activist who runs a trans digital archive, and one of their points around this work was about harm reduction. So like, if somebody later wanted to say, I actually don't want my face shown or my story told because of damage that can come to me, then they, at any point that when they did the consent form, we are allowing that, because that is their autonomy, that is their right, So it can go either way, right? So at some point somebody might say, I don't want people to know that I did XYZ, right? Or I don't want my picture. But so far, people have seen it as like empowering and have felt like encouraged that they've been acknowledged and recognized, in this process, And then one person kind of saw it like as a publicity thing, and I was like, no. Like, so they wanted me to update some of their stuff, and I'm like, no, this is a historical record, and so it was kind of funny.
So I think playing off that, like with Trump's banned words and like the whitewashing of things, I don't know if it's like a question about the like archival process or like your level of organizing these, like how are you thinking about the need to either change searchable terms or, kind of, I guess, put more firewalls up between, these like kind of hateful web searches and what you've created?
No, that's a great question. And you actually bring something up that we want to work on for both sites, is add a search function. Because right now, if somebody was searching, they wanted to find something, like there's no way for them to find it. They have to kind of go through everything. That's another layer that we want to add. And in terms of it landing on like the wrong person's desk, one of the reasons we had to partner with university tech folks is because they have the capacity to securitize our sites, to update them so that they don't lose like functionality, and ensure that there's like no bots coming in, et cetera, et cetera. So for now, because there are no restrictions being placed on us from the institutions, I feel okay. And the fact that they're securitized, through the back end, and that's something I have no access to and don't know much about. Well, I guess time will tell. I'm not sure. We haven't thought that far ahead if we should be changing it, Our websites actually I don't even think they say diversity, equity, inclusion on any of the pages, right? And so that'll be interesting to see like what's caught in this moment, That's a good question, yeah.
I know that you talked about, hopefully getting more funding to, things like developing toolkits and, possibly even lesson plans in terms of like how to use the data. But I'm also curious, you mentioned, yourself being from San Diego and thinking like regionally, like other histories that could also be documented. Like, are there any plans in the future to continue this work, but maybe like in San Diego or other areas of the US?
Yeah, I mean, for the mapping project, we've just recently talked about Southern California as being also, so our point in doing a comparative analysis, well, eventually we'll do this comparative analysis around Arizona and Texas, is because of the region's histories, like the social political histories that are similar yet different. If you think about Southern California, they're also very conservative. There's been a lot of backlash against immigrants. And so to kind of like talk about that history, the 1990s were like the 2010s here around movement work for students, and so anyway, so yes, eventually we'll get there, I hope. I think it would be really important to add. Yeah.
There's a question online. If you have any advice for how we keep the fight during the political climate?
I think that Naomi Klein calls this, moment, oh my gosh, now I'm not gonna remember the term, but she calls it, does anybody remember the word? It starts with an S. This is why you have to do that cognitive test. Yeah. Basically, everything that's coming down on us is intended to confuse and bait us, right? And there's real consequences, right? So it's like you have to balance that between the reality of the moment with the constant stress, right, of this moment. And so for me, it means operating in multiple levels, and I can speak to my experience because that's how I move best in the world, but there's other folks in this room I think that can also respond, that it's important for me to know who my community is, who my neighbors are. Like, we need to know our neighbors. It's not just about like a political community, it's about like who do we have, who is around us, so we know how to be safe and how to take care of one another. And if somebody doesn't want to keep me safe, I need to know that, but also have a political community, right? And I think that, we have to learn how to find that I don't know, balance is the right word. I'm kind of frustrated with that word. So if anybody has a better word, but maybe just trying to, find grounding in both places of taking care of oneself, taking care of your community, taking care of your families, being aware of what's happening in this moment, and being able to respond. I mean, there's rapid response networks. I was at a large community meeting last night, and it's really inspiring. There's just a lot of work that is happening, and we have to remind ourselves that, that we're not alone, that people are, thinking through the future in ways where there's more possibility, and I think that in different moments historically, this has happened, and so how can we learn from those lessons? I mean, from these women, from communities who have resisted, right? Really. So I know that's not the best answer, but that's kind of how I've been thinking about this, and I think it changes, Oh, the shock doctrine, that's what it's called, right? It's like shock, and we become paralyzed, and instead of becoming paralyzed, how do we, maintain like thinking through this moment, like thinking through a future, collectively. Find your people. Yeah.
I wonder then, as you're thinking about how you're going to write up the historical archives, I mean, are you going to use a lens of how looking across time is informing what might be happening now? And then do you have any plans to funding, if you could get funding to go back to either those same people or to recruit a different sort of cohort of women who are now navigating activism at this point in time?
Yeah. I mean, so oral histories are interesting, right? Because you kind of like don't have to do the research review, the IRB, right? And so it's like a different way of doing research. And so in order to document like contemporary movement work, we'd have to sort of change how we do the research. And that's we can do that. It's just and for this project. But yeah, I think it's important, to also, document what's been happening since, since 2010, because lots has happened, and some of my work, when I moved to Arizona from California, I had a real prejudice around like some of the organizing work that was happening here, and that's because I came from a place where I thought, we'd been doing it for so long and we had it all figured out, and then to arrive here was like sort of like a massive learning curve to see the organizing that had always been happening here, but it wasn't as visible, right? And so when 2010 happened, SB 1070, HB 2281, it became part of my own like scholarship to write about what was happening here, because like every day I saw humanitarians doing the work of the community, right? And nobody knew about that. Oh, why you live in Arizona? It's a terrible place, And I'm like, actually, we exist everywhere, right? People who care about one another exist everywhere. And so I started to write about those experiences. And so, yes, basically that has been kind of like my own mission as well, is right to think about making sure that these voices, these stories, these experiences, these lessons, right, skill sharing aren't lost. Yeah. Right?
Time for a final question. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. If you didn't sign in, if you could please do so, and please grab a snack or a drink on the way out.
Thank you.
I don't have any questions. Oh, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. This is great, and it's just hard not to